In the quiet hours before dawn, Tokyo glows like an endless constellation. Office towers shimmer in fluorescent light, each window a small confession of someone still awake, still working. The city never truly sleeps. It only pauses, inhales, and resumes. For many Japanese, rest is not absence of work, it is preparation for more of it. The rhythm of life here has been tuned to the hum of productivity for more than a century, transforming a nation once defined by harmony and reflection into one that measures existence in hours spent behind a desk. The origins of Japan's overwork culture can be traced to the late 19th century, during the Meiji Restoration. When Japan opened its doors to the West after centuries of isolation, it faced a single overwhelming mission: to catch up. In factories and shipyards, men worked 16-hour shifts under banners proclaiming for the nation's prosperity. The idea of labor became sacred, almost spiritual. The word kinro, diligent work, entered the national vocabulary alongside chugi, loyalty. To work tirelessly was to serve the emperor, the company, the family, and, by extension, the soul of Japan itself. After the devastation of World War II, this belief deepened into an unspoken national contract. Japan had been reduced to ruins, its cities flattened, its people displaced. Yet within 2 decades, it re-emerged as an industrial giant. Historians often describe the Japanese miracle, but behind every economic statistic lay a hidden cost: exhaustion. The salaryman, the neatly dressed white-collar worker who boarded the same train every morning and returned home long after midnight, became both a symbol of national pride and a quiet tragedy. He embodied Ganbaru, the spirit of perseverance, and Gammon, the art of enduring hardship without complaint. By the 1960s, the Ministry of Labor had begun documenting the effects of extreme working hours. Newspapers occasionally reported cases of sudden death among healthy men in their 30s and 40s, a phenomenon later named karoshi, literally death by overwork. Yet few protested. In a society where belonging outweighed individuality, quitting or resting could feel like betrayal. "If I leave before my boss, I feel ashamed," confessed a factory worker interviewed in a 1971 NHK documentary. "It's as if my effort disappears the moment I walk out the door." Cultural anthropologists suggest that Japan's overwork ethic is deeply rooted in older values. The feudal system of samurai loyalty evolved into corporate hierarchy. The concept of IE, the household, found a new home in companies, where senior executives became oyabun, or family heads. The group came first, the self second. Failure, even private failure, was not merely personal. It reflected on everyone. The fear of letting others down, known as meiwaku, remains one of the most powerful social pressures in Japan. But beyond duty and fear lies something subtler: the pursuit of purpose. For many Japanese workers, labor is not only obligation, but identity. A sense of self is drawn from usefulness, from being part of something larger. When an employee retires, the sudden emptiness can feel unbearable. In rural towns, elderly men are often seen sweeping streets or tending to parks, not for pay, but to stay connected to the rhythm of contribution. "Work is how we know we exist," says sociologist Noriko Yamada. To stop is to risk disappearing. The story of Japan's overwork culture, however, is not one of greed or exploitation alone. It is also a story of devotion to perfection, to community, to the fragile dignity found in effort. In the decades after the war, this devotion rebuilt cities, birthed technologies, and shaped a global image of Japanese reliability. Trains ran on time to the second. Products were crafted with near-religious precision. The world saw a disciplined people, but inside Japan, the cost was whispered in late-night trains and half-empty family dinners. In 1980, a 35-year-old man named Kenichi Uchino collapsed at his desk at Toyota after working more than 4,000 hours that year, including weekends and holidays. His death became one of the earliest officially recognized cases of karoshi. Newspapers published his photo beside an image of a factory line still running. The contrast was devastating. A man extinguished by the very system he had helped perfect. In the years that followed, more cases surfaced. Teachers, nurses, civil servants, even journalists who died quietly, often with unfinished reports or lesson plans on their desks. Yet despite the tragedies, Japan's collective momentum did not slow. The idea of rest, yasumu, was increasingly treated as indulgence rather than necessity. Even language reflected it. The word for vacation, kyuka, literally means a break from duty. Posters in train stations urged citizens to work harder for the nation, for their families, for honor. And slowly, without anyone deciding it, rest itself became a kind of taboo. Today, Japan stands as one of the most technologically advanced and efficient nations on Earth. But beneath that achievement lies a paradox, a country that perfected the art of productivity, and in doing so, forgot the art of pause. The lights in Tokyo's skyscrapers still glow deep into the night, illuminating not ambition but absence, of sleep, of balance, of stillness. And so begins the story of how an entire nation came to measure worth not by how one lives, but by how long one endures. At the heart of Japan's overwork culture lies a quiet contradiction, a nation that treasures harmony and discipline, yet builds its identity on self-erasure. To understand how this mindset took root, one must look not only at Japan's economy but at its philosophy. The Japanese concept of shigoto, or work, has always been more than labor. It carries moral weight, a sense of duty tied to both social order and personal worth. In Shinto belief, purity comes through repetition, sweeping the shrine daily, bowing, cleaning, maintaining order. The act itself, not the result, brings virtue. When the industrial age arrived, this same devotion transferred seamlessly into modern offices and factories. Efficiency became worship, precision became prayer. The post-war corporate system formalized this spiritual relationship with labor. As Japan rebuilt, companies began offering what they called lifetime employment. A worker joined a firm in his 20s and often stayed until retirement, receiving housing benefits, bonuses, and a sense of belonging. In return, he offered loyalty that bordered on fealty. This system created what sociologists later called the company family. Managers were paternal figures, and workers became devoted sons. The company became the new IE, the household that defined one's social identity. Leaving such a company was not just quitting a job, it was abandoning one's family. By the 1970s, this loyalty had become the engine of Japan's economic miracle. Car manufacturers, electronics giants, and trading corporations dominated global markets. The world admired Japan's discipline, yet few noticed its human cost. A 1975 article in Asahi Shimbun described the white-collar soldier as a man who fights every day without a battlefield. Inside these new corporate armies, personal boundaries dissolved. Workers routinely stayed at the office past midnight, not because of necessity, but to show commitment. The phenomenon known as service overtime, unpaid, voluntary extra work, became normalized. No one questioned it. The act of leaving early was seen as selfish, even shameful. Public transportation, too, reflected this rhythm. Trains leaving central Tokyo after 10 p.m., filled with men in suits, heads bowed, ties loosened, some sleeping upright. Convenience stores adapted by offering meals for one, bento boxes that could be eaten in silence between trains. Even bars evolved to serve exhausted employees too tired to speak. The salaryman's life became so predictable that it inspired entire genres of literature and film. Authors like Haruki Murakami and filmmakers like Juzo Itami began to portray this new archetype, the man who gave everything to his company but could no longer remember why. One of the most haunting aspects of Japan's work culture is how it blurs the line between endurance and identity. The phrase is shokenmei, meaning to do something with one's entire life, became a common compliment for dedicated workers. It literally implies giving one's life to a task. This linguistic detail reveals the psychology behind the phenomenon. In a culture where self-sacrifice has long been considered noble, from samurai dying for their lord to soldiers perishing for the emperor, working oneself to death can be quietly romanticized. The term karoshi did not enter the public lexicon until the 1980s, but the mindset had existed for generations. The media began to expose it through tragedy. In 1987, the death of 24-year-old news reporter Miwa Sato shocked the nation. She had logged 159 hours of overtime in a single month before dying of heart failure at her desk. Her story sparked national debate, but change was slow. Companies issued apologies, yet the unspoken rule persisted. Effort must exceed endurance. As one manager told NHK at the time, We cannot win the world's respect with half-hearted work. His words, meant as pride, echoed a national anxiety, the fear of returning to defeat, to weakness, to the humiliation of post-war dependence. Cultural historians often argue that this fear is the invisible backbone of Japan's work ethic. For decades after 1945, productivity was not merely economic recovery, but spiritual redemption. Each generation was taught that Japan's strength lay not in wealth, but in perseverance. Schools reinforced this idea from childhood. Morning assemblies began with group exercises and slogans like, "Do your best for everyone." Students learned the value of effort, doryoku, over talent. By the time they entered the workforce, they already understood that the group came before the self. To rest was to step out of rhythm with the collective, to risk being left behind. But this devotion also bred isolation. Family dinners grew shorter, marriages weakened, and children learned to sleep without waiting for their fathers to come home. Sociologists in the 1990s coined the term kagafumi, shadow walking, to describe families who shared a house but lived separate lives due to working hours. One wife in a Tokyo suburb once told a reporter, "I see my husband more on the news than in our kitchen." The tragedy was not only physical absence, but emotional distance, a quiet erosion of intimacy that no one had time to notice. By the turn of the millennium, Japan's cities had adapted to accommodate exhaustion. Capsule hotels offered places for workers to collapse for a few hours before dawn. Vending machines sold not only coffee but energy drinks promising instant vitality. The streets at night filled with men too tired to return home, sleeping on benches or subway platforms. Yet the country functioned with mechanical precision. Trains still departed on time, factories still met quotas, and schools still sang their morning songs. From the outside, Japan seemed serene, but beneath the surface, a nation had forgotten what it meant to stop. And in the hum of its progress, silence had become the rarest luxury of all. In the fluorescent corridors of Tokyo's corporate towers, time bends and softens. Morning and night blur into one continuous shift of meetings, paperwork, and silence. Inside, rows of workers sit before glowing screens, the rhythm of typing blending into a quiet, mechanical hum. The air smells faintly of ink, coffee, and fatigue. This is where Japan's devotion to work becomes most visible, not in the factories or construction sites of old, but in the quiet, air-conditioned offices where the nation's pulse beats unseen. For many, the working day begins before sunrise. Commuters fill the trains by 6 a.m., pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces turned toward the floor. Few speak. Most are reviewing emails, reading the morning news, or dozing between stops. The same ritual repeats each day, with precision that mirrors the train schedule itself. A life lived according to timetables, predictable, punctual, unchanging. And yet beneath that order lies a shared weariness that no one dares to name. The archetype of the salaryman, the suited, dutiful office worker, was once a national hero. He represented discipline, respectability, and sacrifice. In the 1960s, television commercials often showed him coming home late, greeted by a smiling wife and children. "He works for us," the narrator would say. But the image was fiction. In reality, many fathers saw their children only on weekends, sometimes not even then. When the economic bubble of the 1980s burst, the illusion of stability shattered. Yet the culture of loyalty remained. Japan's economy slowed, wages stagnated, and job security weakened. But the expectation to endure did not fade. It deepened. Inside companies, the pressure comes not only from above, but from the side. The Japanese concept of senpai kohai, senior and junior, governs every social interaction. Psychologists describe hikikomori as a response to social pressure, a refusal to participate in the endless competition. But even in retreat, they are judged harshly. Parents whisper about shame, neighbors avoid eye contact. In a culture that values contribution above all, non-participation is the ultimate sin. Stories of collapse appear regularly in the news. A nurse who fainted during a shift after working 100 consecutive hours. A junior banker found unconscious at her desk. A delivery driver who fell asleep at the wheel. Each case sparks brief outrage, a public promise of reform, and then silence. Work continues. A few years ago, a journalist wrote in Nikkei Asia, "Japan doesn't need to be told to work less, it needs permission to stop." The phrase resonated deeply because it touched a hidden truth. Rest here is not forbidden by law, but by expectation. The roots of that expectation run deep into the nation's psyche. Japanese society prizes harmony, above conflict. To challenge the system, even for one's own well-being, feels like disturbing the peace. And so people smile through exhaustion, apologize for taking vacations, and bow while boarding the last train home. Their exhaustion becomes invisible, woven into the texture of everyday life, as ordinary as cherry blossoms falling, as constant as the sound of the train doors closing. And yet, there is beauty even in this tragedy. The same devotion that exhausts Japan also builds its quiet grace, the care with which clerks wrap a parcel, the precision of a factory worker assembling a camera, the elegance of a chef's gesture while preparing sushi at midnight. It is the paradox of Japan's spirit that the pursuit of perfection gives birth to both art and suffering. To live here is to walk that narrow line between creation and collapse, and to do so with a bow, a smile, and the unspoken promise to keep going tomorrow. If one wants to understand how deeply overwork has become ingrained in Japan's social fabric, it is enough to step into the streets of Tokyo at midnight. The office towers glow like glass lanterns, the trains still run, carrying passengers whose faces are pale under the harsh light. Convenience stores hum quietly, offering warm rice balls and canned coffee to those who have missed dinner once again. Somewhere near Shimbashi Station, known as the salaryman's graveyard, a man in a dark suit sleeps sitting upright on a bench, his briefcase clutched like a lifeline. This is not a scene of despair, but of routine. No one stops to wake him. He will rise before dawn, straighten his tie, and board the train to do it all again. Japan's dedication to work is not enforced by whips or bosses, but by something far subtler: mutual expectation. To be seen as idle is to be excluded. At companies large and small, the unspoken rule is simple. The last person to leave the office shows the greatest loyalty. Supervisors rarely order overtime outright. Instead, they linger at their desks, ensuring subordinates stay as well. A junior employee who leaves early risks silent disapproval, a small frown that says everything words cannot. Over time, that silence becomes law. The phrase shigoto baka, work fool, is used half-jokingly to describe those who cannot stop working even when they should. Yet beneath the humor lies admiration. The shigoto baka is the one who sacrifices personal comfort for professional pride. In television dramas and novels, such characters are portrayed as tragic heroes, their exhaustion noble, their loneliness dignified. A 1989 commercial for a major electronics company captured this ideal perfectly. A man standing alone on a rainy street, briefcase in hand as the slogan appeared. For your company, for your country, for tomorrow. The line echoed the wartime propaganda of the 1940s, only now the enemy was inefficiency, not an opposing army. This devotion has shaped not only workplaces, but also families. In countless homes, wives manage the household and children, while husbands disappear into offices and meetings. They are called goshujin no inai kate, homes without husbands. Many women refer to themselves as shufu, housewives, but the term carries loneliness rather than leisure. One woman interviewed in a 2002 NHK documentary described her marriage as a partnership in absence. Her husband worked for a trading company, often returning after midnight. "We've been married 20 years, she said softly. "If I add up all the hours we've spent together, maybe 2. Even rest has been systematized. In Japan, there's a word for sleeping in public, inamurai, which translates as being present while asleep. It describes the sight of exhausted commuters napping on trains or workers dozing briefly at their desks. Far from being shameful, inamuri is often seen as proof of dedication, evidence that one has worked hard enough to collapse. A study by the University of Tokyo found that nearly 40% of office employees practice inamuri daily, often during lunch breaks or train rides. In this culture, even sleep becomes another form of productivity. Government attempts to address the crisis have struggled against this ingrained mindset. In 2018, Japan introduced a work-style reform law, limiting overtime to 100 hours per month. Yet surveys show that many companies quietly exceed this limit. Enforcement remains difficult because the boundary between mandatory and voluntary labor is blurred. The Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare continues to record hundreds of deaths attributed to overwork each year: heart attacks, strokes, suicides. But these are only the cases recognized. Experts estimate the true number may be 10 times higher. In smaller towns and factories, overwork takes a different shape. There, loyalty is more personal. Workers feel indebted to their employers, who may be local figures known since childhood. In one metal workshop in Osaka, an elderly foreman explains, "We don't work long hours because we must. We do it because this place is like our home." His words sound warm, but behind them lies a lifelong dependency. The company provides not only income, but identity. To quit would mean to vanish. Psychologists describe Japan's overwork culture as a collective addiction. The country's post-war success created a national self-image built on endurance. To stop striving would feel like betraying the ancestors who rebuilt Japan from rubble. The collective memory of defeat, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, surrender, still lingers as an invisible motivator. The reconstruction that followed demanded absolute effort, and that ethos never faded. Even today, older generations view long hours as a moral duty, not a burden. But a quiet transformation has begun. In co-working spaces across Tokyo and Kyoto, young entrepreneurs are experimenting with flexible schedules, remote work, and shared childcare arrangements. Companies like Panasonic and Fujitsu now test 4-day work weeks. Yet the transition remains fragile. Many who attempt it face skepticism from colleagues. "It feels like swimming against the current," says one software engineer. Even when you finish your tasks, you worry about being judged. In this contradiction, between progress and tradition, health and duty, Japan stands at a crossroads. The lights of its offices still burn deep into the night, but in some windows, they flicker off earlier than before. It is a small change, almost invisible in the city's vast glow. Yet for those few who dare to leave while the trains still run, the act feels revolutionary, as if, in reclaiming a few hours of sleep, they are also reclaiming something larger: the right to be human again. The turning point in Japan's relationship with work came during the 1990s, the so-called lost decade. After the collapse of the asset bubble in 1991, Japan's long economic miracle finally stalled. For the first time in post-war history, the promise that hard work would guarantee prosperity broke. Companies downsized, lifetime employment began to fade, and entire generations discovered that loyalty was not a shield against uncertainty. Yet even as salaries fell and benefits disappeared, the culture of overwork did not weaken. It hardened. If anything, it became a means of survival, the only way to prove one's worth in an economy that no longer guaranteed success. The word furita, derived from free and arbiter, worker, entered everyday speech to describe young people moving between part-time jobs. The older generation viewed them with suspicion, seeing idleness where there was only fatigue. "They just don't want to struggle," one retired manager told Yomiuri Shimbun in 1998. But the reality was more complex. Japan's rigid hiring system excluded those who did not fit its traditional mold. Once someone left a full-time job or failed to secure one after graduation, re-entry into stable employment became nearly impossible. For these young adults, flexibility was not freedom, it was exile. During this period, suicides linked to overwork and economic stress rose sharply. In 1998 alone, Japan recorded over 32,000 suicides, the highest since the war. Many of the victims were men in their 40s and 50s who had recently lost jobs or faced impossible workloads. Newspapers carried brief, restrained headlines. Company employee found deceased at workplace. Teacher's sudden death suspected to be overwork. The details were rarely printed, but the message was clear. Despair had become routine. The government, under mounting pressure, began to address karoshi publicly. The first official recognition of a karoshi death in court came in 2002, setting a precedent for compensation. Families of victims, often widows, began to speak out. One of them, a woman named Harumi Koga, whose husband collapsed at his advertising firm after 110 hours of overtime in a month, became a quiet activist. "I don't want revenge," she said at a press conference. "I want Japan to remember that our lives are not measured by our paychecks." Her words struck a nerve, echoing in households across the country. Meanwhile, a new phenomenon emerged: karojisatsu, suicide by overwork. Unlike karoshi, which describes physical collapse, Karojisatsu refers to psychological exhaustion leading to suicide. Mental health clinics, once stigmatized, began reporting a flood of patients suffering from burnout and depression. The Japanese term utsu, melancholy, became widely discussed for the first time. Yet despite the growing awareness, few dared to seek help openly. Within the corporate structure, admitting weakness remained taboo. Managers viewed therapy as a sign of instability. Co-workers avoided those who took leave. The unwritten rule persisted: suffer silently. In 2007, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe introduced the Work-Life Balance Charter, a policy aimed at restoring equilibrium. It encouraged companies to reduce overtime, promote flexible hours, and value family life. The government even introduced a national Premium Friday initiative, urging workers to leave early once a month. But participation was minimal. In a 2018 survey, only 11% of employees said they had ever left work early on a Premium Friday. The idea, while well-intentioned, clashed with reality. If a superior remained at his desk, few dared to stand up and walk away. Real change, when it came, was slow and subtle. Some of Japan's most traditional corporations began experimenting with reform. Toyota, infamous for its demanding work culture, instituted caps on overtime and promoted no meeting days. Smaller firms introduced meditation rooms and nap spaces. In the technology sector, startups like Taibozu began advocating work without overwork, creating systems that allow employees to choose their own schedules. These experiments attracted media attention, though many workers admitted they still felt guilty for using them. At the same time, a quieter revolution was unfolding among women. As more entered the workforce, they challenged the old gender division that sustained overwork. Men at the office, women at home. Female professionals began voicing concerns about matahara, or maternity harassment, where pregnant workers were pressured to resign. Advocacy groups like Work-Life Balance Japan organized seminars and legal support for women demanding fair treatment. The conversation gradually expanded to include fathers as well, introducing the idea of ikumen, men who take active roles in child rearing. Although progress was uneven, it marked the beginning of a cultural shift, a realization that rest and family are not indulgences but essential parts of life. Yet for every story of reform, there were others of quiet endurance. In Osaka, a 58-year-old factory supervisor worked 13-hour days even after being diagnosed with high blood pressure. "I can't stop," he told a reporter. "If I slow down, who will lead my men?" In Tokyo, a young office clerk admitted she rarely takes her annual leave because her coworkers might resent her absence. "We all stay together," she said. Remote work, introduced as a form of convenience, blurred boundaries further. "It feels like my boss lives in my pocket," one Tokyo employee confessed in an online forum. The digital revolution, which promised freedom, had instead made the concept of off hours disappear. In this period, karoshi and karojisatsu continued to claim lives, though rarely made headlines. The Ministry of Health reported over 2,000 officially recognized cases in 2019, but NGOs estimated the real number exceeded 10,000 annually. The victims ranged from factory workers to teachers, from nurses to game developers. In 2015, a particularly tragic case reignited national debate: the suicide of 24-year-old Matsuri Takahashi, an employee of advertising giant Dentsu. She had worked more than 100 hours of overtime per month before taking her life on Christmas Day. Her final message on social media read, "Why must we endure this much?" Public outrage followed, but what made the case truly significant was not its tragedy. There had been many before, but its visibility. Takahashi's mother refused silence. She spoke on national television, demanding corporate accountability. For the first time, the face of Karoshi was not a middle-aged man in a gray suit, but a young woman, bright and full of promise. The story forced Japan to confront an uncomfortable truth. Overwork was no longer confined to a generation shaped by post-war reconstruction. It was consuming the young, the very people meant to inherit the nation's future. In response, the government introduced new reforms. Companies with a history of karoshi cases were publicly named and fined. Awareness campaigns encouraged workers to take kyuka, paid leave, and posters appeared in train stations showing smiling employees leaving the office early. Yet these campaigns often felt hollow. "We are told to rest," said one office worker in a BBC interview, But when we do, we are seen as lazy. The stigma surrounding rest persisted, unspoken yet powerful. In meetings, managers would praise those who work through pain. Compliments like, "He never takes a day off," or "She's always here before sunrise," remained badges of honor. Meanwhile, an unexpected social phenomenon emerged. Shachiku, literally corporate livestock. The term, coined by internet users, described employees who lived entirely at the mercy of their employers, sacrificing health and identity in exchange for stability. It was used ironically but carried a sting of truth. Memes, cartoons, and online posts portrayed exhausted workers as animals in suits, chained to their desks. The humor was dark, but for many, it was the only safe form of rebellion. As society began to question the cost of endless work, a new generation of thinkers, artists, and small business owners started redefining success. The minimalist movement, inspired by Zen philosophy, found a strong following among young Japanese. Writers like Fumio Sasaki and Marie Kondo encouraged people to declutter not only their homes, but their lives. Owning less, Sasaki wrote, means worrying less, and perhaps working less. Their message resonated with those who had grown up watching their parents consumed by the corporate machine. For the first time, simplicity became fashionable, a quiet protest against materialism and burnout. Even corporations, sensing cultural change, began to adapt. Tech companies in Tokyo and Osaka experimented with wellness policies, encouraging short naps during work hours and mandatory vacations after large projects. In some places, office lights automatically dimmed after 8 p.m. to discourage overtime. Yet for every step forward, the past pulled back. Many employees turned off the sensors or stayed late in darkened rooms, illuminated only by their computer screens. "We're not working," one said jokingly. "We're just not leaving." Japan's work culture had become a mirror of its deepest virtues and flaws. The same discipline that built its bullet trains, robotics, and meticulous service industry also chained it to the idea that worth comes only through effort. The same pursuit of harmony, that kept workplaces orderly also silenced cries for change. The system did not force people to overwork. It invited them to do so willingly, with pride. And that was what made it so unbreakable. By 2020, a quiet fatigue spread across the nation, more spiritual than physical. Japan's population was aging rapidly, birth rates were at record lows, and younger generations no longer saw purpose in the traditional path of work and sacrifice. Some left the cities for rural towns, choosing simpler lives. Others stayed but detached emotionally from their companies, performing the bare minimum, a new phenomenon dubbed quiet quitting. What had once been devotion was now apathy, not out of laziness, but as an act of quiet preservation. In the midst of all this, the question lingered like a whisper in every office corridor and empty train carriage. If a society can build perfection through exhaustion, what happens when perfection is no longer enough? The answer, perhaps, lay not in working harder or resting more, but in rediscovering something Japan had lost along the way: the meaning of balance and the grace of simply being still. The global pandemic of 2020 marked an unexpected experiment in Japan's centuries-old relationship with work. For the first time, millions of employees were ordered to stay home. The long, crowded commutes that had defined daily life suddenly vanished. The trains, once filled with sleeping salarymen and rushing office clerks, ran nearly empty. The ritual of bowing to superiors each morning was replaced by video meetings, and the faint hum of keyboards echoed not in glass towers, but in small apartments and suburban homes. What began as an emergency measure soon became a revelation. It was possible to work without being constantly watched, and life, for many, felt slightly more breathable. Yet even during this forced pause, Japan's deep-seated habits did not fade easily. Many employees found themselves unable to disconnect, logging in earlier and staying online later than ever. The walls between personal and professional life dissolved. "Remote work just means the office followed me home," a systems engineer in Yokohama said in an NHK report. For parents, especially women, the burden grew heavier. With schools closed, they juggled conference calls and childcare, embodying Japan's enduring imbalance between genders. The illusion of rest became yet another form of pressure. Still, the pandemic cracked something open in the nation's collective consciousness. For decades, Japan had been trapped in a rhythm of silent endurance. But isolation gave people time to reflect. Social media began to fill with posts about Jinsei no Taima, a timeout from life. Users shared stories of rediscovering forgotten hobbies, taking walks, and spending time with family members they had barely seen awake. Younger generations began openly questioning the logic of a system that rewarded suffering over happiness. "If dying from overwork is loyalty," one university student wrote, "then I'd rather be disloyal." The comment went viral. Economically, remote work posed new challenges. Traditional corporations, built on hierarchy and physical presence, struggled to adapt. Middle managers who once derived authority from their desks found themselves uncertain in the digital landscape. But startups and creative industries thrived. Freed from office rents and long commutes, they began attracting young professionals who valued freedom over prestige. In a few years, work from anywhere evolved from a foreign concept to a quiet revolution. Even major companies like Hitachi and Fujitsu announced permanent hybrid systems. For Japan, this was radical, not because of the technology, but because it questioned the sacredness of the office itself. However, the psychological toll of the old order remained. Experts warned of hataraki jirai, a term describing guilt associated with not working. Surveys found that even when people were not required to clock in, many continued working beyond their hours out of anxiety or habit. "Work has become our identity," said Dr. Tamahiro Suzuki, a sociologist at Waseda University. "Without it, we don't know who we are." His observation echoed a national truth. Japan had built a collective sense of purpose around labor so completely that rest itself felt like a void. During the same period, the government attempted once again to address karoshi. New guidelines reduced legal overtime to 45 hours per month, and companies were required to track employee health more strictly. Public awareness campaigns showed bright posters with slogans like "Hitori de gaman shinai de," "Don't endure alone." But many citizens found the message ironic. Japan's deepest cultural values, perseverance, humility, self-sacrifice, stood in quiet contradiction to the idea of speaking out. A junior employee would rather collapse at his desk than risk being seen as weak before his team. Change, therefore, moved not by decree but by attrition, one generation growing too weary to maintain the illusion. Meanwhile, a new and subtler danger spread: digital burnout. Japan's famously efficient infrastructure meant that even at home, workers were expected to perform flawlessly. Broadband internet and advanced communication tools removed every excuse for delay. Companies began monitoring productivity through software, measuring keystrokes, meeting attendance, and camera activity. The surveillance of presence, once physical, became virtual. In some firms, employees reported keeping their webcams on from morning until night. "It's strange," one accountant said. "I'm alone, but I still feel watched." In parallel, Japan's shrinking population began amplifying the crisis. With fewer young workers entering the market, existing employees shouldered heavier loads. By 2025, the country faced a projected labor shortage of nearly 7 million people. Automation helped, but it also reinforced the cycle. Machines replaced manual labor, but humans compensated by working more complex, mentally draining tasks. The salaryman became less a symbol of progress and more a relic, a ghost from a past that refused to rest. Yet amid exhaustion, a quiet rebellion grew. In Kyoto, small family-owned cafes started displaying handwritten signs reading "Yasumu no wa ii koto desu," "It's good to rest." In Fukuoka, a former banker opened a nap cafe, where customers could rent private rooms for short midday sleeps. Books like The Art of Doing Nothing and Slow Japan became unexpected bestsellers. Magazines published features on the beauty of ma, the traditional Japanese aesthetic of empty space, once an artistic concept, now reinterpreted as an argument for slowing down. These were small movements, often mocked by mainstream commentators as hipster indulgences, but they represented something profound: the rediscovery of stillness as a virtue. For centuries, Japanese philosophy had revered balance, the harmony of yin and yang, effort and rest, action and contemplation. Somewhere between the Meiji era's modernization and the post-war economic miracle, that harmony had been lost. Now, piece by piece, it was being remembered. Still, the struggle remained immense. Japan's social machinery had been built around diligence, and altering its rhythm would take generations. But in quiet apartments, on silent trains, and in offices where lights began to dim earlier than before, something was changing, not loudly, not through protest, but through fatigue that had finally become self-awareness. The question was no longer whether Japan could stop working. It was whether it could learn, once again, to simply be. By the mid-2020s, Japan stood at a crossroads between two worlds: the industrial empire that once rose from the ashes of war and the fragile, aging society struggling to redefine itself. The mythology of endless labor had begun to erode, yet no clear alternative had taken its place. Corporate towers still gleamed in Tokyo's Marunouchi district, but inside, the rhythm was slower, quieter. Some companies shortened the work week to 4 days. Others introduced AI systems that handled scheduling, data entry, and logistics, allowing humans to focus on creative tasks. Yet the old reflex remained. When freed from one burden, workers often filled the space with another. Productivity, not peace, was still the ultimate goal. The younger generation, those born after 1995, became the first to publicly reject this inheritance. Surveys by Nikkei in 2024 revealed that more than 60% of workers under 30 preferred meaningful leisure over higher salaries. Unlike their parents, they did not dream of climbing a corporate ladder, but of escaping it. Many quit stable jobs to open small cafes, design studios, or online craft shops. The term Nije Jozu, meaning skilled at escaping, became a badge of pride. For them, leaving a company was not failure but freedom. We saw what loyalty did to our fathers, one 28-year-old freelance designer told Asahi Shimbun. In our time, one executive told NHK, "We worked for the company like it was family. Now they just want to rest." His words carried nostalgia but also confusion, an echo of a generation unable to separate identity from work. Psychologists noticed another quiet epidemic: achievement guilt. Young professionals, despite rejecting overwork, still felt uneasy when idle. The centuries-old Confucian idea that virtue is proven through effort lingered in the national psyche. People went to productivity cafes, where silence and strict time limits mimicked the discipline of an office. Apps tracked study hours and self-improvement goals. Even rest had to be optimized. Japan turned relaxation into another kind of labor, a Tokyo University researcher observed. We schedule our peace the way we once scheduled our pain. Outside urban centers, however, different rhythms emerged. In rural prefectures like Shimane and Akita, abandoned villages began to fill with young families escaping city life. They revived old crafts, brewed sake, and cultivated small farms. These U-turn migrants described their choice not as retreat, but as rediscovery. "I wanted to remember what my grandparents called slow time," one farmer said. Government subsidies supported this trend, branding it as Chiho Susei, regional revitalization. Ironically, the very places once emptied by modernization now offered a glimpse of a gentler Japan. Meanwhile, on the global stage, Japan's struggle became an object of fascination. Western journalists described it as the country that forgot how to rest, a living paradox of serenity and exhaustion. Academic conferences compared karoshi to the burnout crises emerging in Europe and America, suggesting Japan was not alone but merely ahead, a mirror reflecting the future of all industrial nations. The difference, however, lay in how Japan confronted it, not through protest or collapse, but through quiet reflection. Change in Japan rarely comes from revolution. It comes from the gradual erosion of certainty. By 2027, signs of that erosion were everywhere. Once crowded commuter trains began running half-empty even during rush hour, as hybrid work became the norm. Tokyo's skyline glittered the same, but the streets felt softer, fewer briefcases, more bicycles. Cafes stayed open later, not for business meetings, but for quiet reading and conversation. Yet underneath this calm, a question pulsed like a hidden current. Could Japan truly let go of the idea that rest is waste? The answer was still forming, in the spaces between trains, in the silence after emails went unanswered, in the long exhale of a nation beginning, at last, to pause. By 2028, the quiet transformation that had begun as small acts of resistance was turning into a slow societal awakening. Japan's long-standing relationship with labor was no longer unquestioned. It was being dissected, debated and reimagined in classrooms, media, and even corporate boardrooms. The idea that hard work was inherently virtuous had lost some of its sanctity. For the first time since the post-war boom, being constantly busy was not considered a badge of honor. Instead, people began to speak of ikiru tama no hataraki, working to live, not living to work. This linguistic shift, subtle yet profound, marked a generational rupture. The government, faced with economic stagnation and rising mental health crises, began framing rest itself as a public necessity. Campaigns promoted mental well-being as productivity. Television programs featured psychiatrists and cultural figures discussing burnout in open, compassionate terms, a sharp contrast to the stoicism of past decades. In schools, teachers introduced lessons about mindfulness and emotional health. Some corporations hired Hataraki reform consultants, whose job was to redesign work structures to reduce overtime and improve morale. Even the Ministry of Health launched a sleep white paper, revealing that the average Japanese adult slept only 6 hours per night, one of the lowest figures in the developed world. The report's title asked a question that resonated across the country. Can a nation that never sleeps ever dream? Meanwhile, technology began to both help and hinder recovery. Artificial intelligence automated scheduling, logistics, and repetitive office tasks, freeing workers from many traditional burdens. But it also introduced new anxieties: constant monitoring, algorithmic performance reviews, and data-driven pressure to optimize every minute. "The computer has become our new boss," remarked one worker from Osaka, half in jest. Many employees reported feeling more isolated as remote work reduced human interaction to digital screens. What had once been camaraderie now felt like simulation. The sense of belonging, once a defining feature of Japanese workplaces, was fading into silence. Cultural memory, however, proved difficult to erase. In many families, older generations still viewed sacrifice as sacred. Grandparents who had lived through Japan's economic miracle told their grandchildren stories of how diligence rebuilt the nation. Without work, they would say, we would still be starving. But their audience no longer shared the same hunger. For younger Japanese, survival was not the issue. Meaning was. The struggle had shifted from rebuilding a destroyed nation to rebuilding the self. That generational divide widened into an emotional gulf. Elderly men in izakayas complained about lazy youth, while their grandchildren quietly wondered why rest had ever been a sin. Interestingly, as Japan's obsession with work waned, an unexpected phenomenon emerged: the rediscovery of leisure as a cultural art. Museums saw a rise in visitors. Parks that had long stood empty on weekdays began filling with picnicking families. Traditional crafts like kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, regained popularity as metaphors for healing. Meditation studios opened in old warehouses once used for manufacturing. On weekends, Tokyo's train stations filled not with workers commuting, but with travelers seeking quiet coastal towns, hot springs, and shrines. For many, travel became not escape, but therapy, a way to reconnect with what had always been present but forgotten: the rhythm of slowness. However, this rediscovery was not without tension. Japan's economy, heavily dependent on corporate loyalty and long working hours, faced the reality of declining productivity. Some economists warned that the pendulum was swinging too far, predicting stagnation if the culture of effort eroded completely. Yet others argued that a society cannot sustain innovation through exhaustion. "A tired mind cannot imagine the future," said cultural historian Koji Harada. His words echoed in editorials and talk shows, becoming symbolic of a nation negotiating between survival and serenity. In rural areas, the return of younger generations sparked fragile hope. Towns that had been dying for decades began to bloom again. Small schools reopened. Local businesses revived festivals that had not been held since the 1980s. A new kind of pride took shape, not in economic output, but in continuity. The Japanese word komorebi, meaning sunlight filtered through trees, became a symbol of this quiet renewal. It appeared in poetry, advertisements, and documentaries as shorthand for peace after decades of relentless motion. But for every step toward balance, there remained ghosts of the past. Annual reports continued to document hundreds of karoshi cases. News stories of suicides among teachers, truck drivers, and junior doctors reminded the nation that the problem was far from gone. Work culture may have softened at the surface, but its foundations, duty, loyalty, fear of shame, ran deep. A 2028 poll showed that nearly 70% of employees still felt moral guilt when taking time off, even when legally entitled. "I don't want to cause trouble for others," one nurse said, echoing a phrase as old as Japan's social code itself. Yet amidst this contradiction, progress and paralysis, something remarkable was taking place. Artists, writers, and thinkers began reframing rest not as retreat, but as resistance. In one viral essay, novelist Mieko Kawakami wrote, "To close one's eyes in Japan is not to give up. It is to heal a wound that work will not." Her words struck a collective nerve. Across social media, people began sharing photos of quiet moments. Empty trains, sunlight through paper windows, steaming cups of tea, tagged simply with Takeru Nemu Japan, the sleeping Japan. What began as an aesthetic became a movement. By the decade's end, the Japanese no longer saw rest as weakness, but as something quietly revolutionary. The struggle was not over. It might never be. But the national conversation had shifted irrevocably. The age of silent suffering was fading, replaced by a gentler rhythm of awareness. The old empire of labor had begun to crumble, not through revolt or collapse, but through the simple, radical act of stopping and listening, at last, to the sound of their own breath. As Japan entered the 2030s, a quiet maturity began to settle over the country's long, complicated relationship with work. The decades of relentless striving, from post-war reconstruction to the digital revolution, had left behind a deep fatigue, but also a rare kind of wisdom. The national conversation had shifted from how to work better to why we work at all. Across government offices, universities, and households, people began asking questions that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. What is a good life? What is enough? And can a society that once worshipped diligence learn to find value in stillness? The answers were not simple. Japan's economy remained fragile, its population continued to shrink, and many industries faced pressure to maintain the efficiency that had defined the nation's identity for nearly a century. Yet even within those constraints, something fundamental was changing. The rigid uniformity of the salaryman model, the gray suit, the long commute, the unspoken loyalty, was giving way to new forms of living. Shared workspaces replaced towering offices. Flexible schedules allowed families to stay together. Younger employees began to value mental health over seniority. And in small but symbolic ways, even the architecture of cities adapted. Office towers incorporated gardens, schools introduced nap rooms, and railway ads that once glorified productivity now encouraged people to rest. Cultural memory, though, still lingered like a shadow. The older generation watched this new rhythm with unease. For those who had sacrificed youth and health for the nation's prosperity, rest still carried the sting of guilt. "If we had stopped, Japan would not exist today," said one retired factory foreman in Nagoya. His words reflected not stubbornness, but a genuine fear that the hard lessons of rebuilding could be forgotten. Yet the younger generations did not reject their elders. They reinterpreted them. They saw in their grandparents not martyrs, but cautionary tales, proof of what happens when devotion becomes identity. Philosophers and artists began framing the crisis of overwork not merely as an economic issue, but as a spiritual one. In television documentaries and literature, a recurring phrase appeared: "The soul needs idleness." The concept drew on ancient Zen teachings about mu, the space of nothingness, not emptiness as absence, but as potential. For centuries, Japan's art, poetry, and garden design had honored stillness as sacred. Now, after decades of motion, those same values were being rediscovered, this time as medicine. Rest was no longer the absence of progress, it was the condition for renewal. Technology, paradoxically, helped restore humanity. Artificial intelligence took over many repetitive or mechanical tasks, allowing people to focus on care, teaching, and creativity. The balance between man and machine that post-war Japan had struggled to define was finally beginning to stabilize. A young engineer at Sony described his generation's vision simply: "We build machines so that people can have time again." The phrase became a motto of sorts, capturing the quiet optimism of a society learning to slow down. Still, Challenges persisted. Rural depopulation accelerated in some regions despite revitalization programs, and the cost of living in major cities remained high. Yet in the midst of these difficulties, an unexpected shift occurred. Community replaced competition. Neighborhood time banks, where people traded hours of service instead of money, became popular. Retired workers mentored young entrepreneurs. Intergenerational cafes, where elderly volunteers served coffee to students, flourished. These were small acts, but together they created something that had long been missing: connection without productivity.